Mrs. Rebecca Hayes had been teaching high school English for 12 years, and she thought she'd seen everything. Every September brought a new wave of teenagers through her classroom door, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles. But on the first day of the fall semester, when she looked at the attendance sheet and called out, "Daniel Park," something stopped her cold. The boy who quietly raised his hand didn't look at her. He sat in the very last row, right next to the window, his dark hair falling across his forehead like he was trying to hide behind it. While other students chatted excitedly about their summers, comparing tans and vacation stories, Daniel stared down at his desk. His backpack sat at his feet, worn at the edges, and his clothes were clean but looked a size too big, like they belonged to someone else. Rebecca made a mental note but continued with her first-day routine. She talked about what they'd be reading that year, handed out syllabi, and tried to inject some enthusiasm into the usual beginning-of-school speeches. Throughout it all, Daniel never looked up once. When the bell rang, students rushed out in a cluster of noise and energy. Daniel waited until everyone left before gathering his things slowly, deliberately, as if he had nowhere to be and all the time in the world. The same pattern repeated itself the next day, and the day after that. Daniel always arrived just before the bell rang, never a minute early. He'd take his seat in the back corner and pull out a notebook, but Rebecca noticed he spent more time staring out the window than taking notes. During group discussions, he remained silent. When she asked him direct questions, he'd answer in as few words as possible, his voice barely above a whisper. By the end of the first week, Rebecca's curiosity got the better of her. During her planning period, she walked down to the guidance counselor's office. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her computer and smiled, but the smile faded when Rebecca mentioned Daniel's name. "That poor boy," Mrs. Patterson said, pulling up his file. "He's been through more than any kid should have to handle." She explained that Daniel had lost both his parents in a terrible car accident 2 years ago. Since then, he'd been in and out of foster homes. The current placement was his fourth. Each time something went wrong, not because of Daniel, but because of circumstances beyond his control. One family moved out of state. Another had a medical emergency. The third simply decided they weren't ready for a teenager. Rebecca felt her heart sink. She thanked Mrs. Patterson and walked back to her classroom, but she couldn't stop thinking about that quiet boy in the back row. That afternoon, when Daniel's class filed in, she watched him more carefully. She noticed the way he held himself, shoulders curved inward like he was trying to take up as little space as possible. She saw how his eyes would occasionally dart toward other students when they laughed together. A flash of something that looked like longing before he'd look away again. When she handed back their first writing assignment the following week, Rebecca made sure to stop at Daniel's desk. He'd written a short essay about his favorite place, and he'd chosen the public library. His writing was beautiful, surprisingly mature, full of vivid descriptions and honest emotion. She'd given him an A+ and written a note at the top. "This is exceptional work. Please see me after class." Daniel looked at the paper, then at her, panic flickering across his face. Rebecca smiled gently and moved on to the next student, but she could feel his anxiety from across the room. When the bell rang, he took his time packing up again, and she wondered if he was going to slip out without speaking to her. But he approached her desk, gripping his backpack strap so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You wanted to see me?" His voice was quiet, uncertain. "I did," Rebecca said, keeping her tone warm and casual. "I wanted to tell you that your essay was really something special. You have a real gift for writing." Daniel blinked like he wasn't sure he'd heard her correctly. "Oh, thanks. Have you ever thought about joining the Creative Writing Club? They meet on Thursdays after school." He shook his head quickly. "I can't, I have to catch the bus." Rebecca nodded, not wanting to push. "Well, if you ever want to talk about writing or if you need a quiet place to work on assignments, my classroom is open after school most days. Just so you know." Daniel mumbled another thank you and left. Rebecca didn't expect him to take her up on the offer, but the next afternoon, as she was grading papers at her desk, she heard a soft knock. Daniel stood in the doorway looking like he might bolt at any second. "Is it okay if I do my homework here?" he asked. "The house I'm staying at is kind of loud right now." "Of course," Rebecca said, gesturing to the empty classroom. "Make yourself comfortable." He chose a desk in the middle of the room, not quite as far back as usual, and pulled out his books. Rebecca went back to her grading and they worked in companionable silence. When the afternoon light started to fade, Daniel packed up his things. Same time tomorrow? Rebecca asked casually. Something flickered in Daniel's expression, something that might have been relief. Yeah, if that's okay. It's more than okay. And so a routine began. Every day after school, Daniel would appear in her doorway. Sometimes he did homework. Sometimes he just sat and stared out the window. Rebecca never pushed him to talk, never asked intrusive questions. She just made sure he knew the space was his, that he was welcome. Weeks passed this way. Rebecca started noticing small things. Daniel began arriving to class a few minutes early instead of at the last second. He'd make brief eye contact when answering questions. Once, when another student made a joke, she caught the ghost of a smile on his face. Then came the day in late October when they were reading poems in class. Rebecca had chosen a collection that included works about family and belonging. When she read one particular poem aloud, about a child watching their mother cook in the kitchen, she noticed Daniel's hand trembling. His eyes were fixed on his desk and his jaw was clenched tight. After class, he didn't come to her room. Rebecca worried she'd pushed too far with the poem selection, that she'd caused him pain by accident. But at 5 o'clock, when she was about to leave for the day, Daniel appeared. His eyes were red. "Can I stay here for a while?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "As long as you need," Rebecca said. He sat down heavily in one of the desks, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The classroom was quiet except for the hum of the heating system and the distant sounds of the custodian working in the hallway. "Tomorrow is the anniversary," Daniel said suddenly. 2 years since the accident. Rebecca's heart clenched. "I'm so sorry, Daniel." He nodded, staring at his hands. "I keep waiting for it to hurt less, but it doesn't. It just feels different. Like I'm forgetting what they looked like. What they sounded like." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I'm scared I'm going to forget them completely." Rebecca moved to sit in the desk next to him, maintaining a respectful distance but showing she was there. "Can I tell you something?" He looked at her with those hollow eyes that had haunted her since the first day of school. 5 years ago, I lost my husband to cancer, and I know it's not the same as what you went through, but I understand that fear. The fear of forgetting." She took a breath. "But here's what I've learned. The people we love, they become part of us. They're in the things we do, the way we see the world, the words we choose when we write. You carry your parents with you every single day, Daniel. That essay you wrote about the library? I could feel your mother's love in every word, even though you never mentioned her. It's there. She's there." Daniel's face crumpled, and for the first time since she'd met him, he cried. Not the silent tears that sometimes slipped down his cheeks when he thought no one was looking, but real, gasping sobs. Rebecca didn't try to comfort him with meaningless platitudes. She just sat there, present and steady, while he let out the grief he'd been carrying alone for so long. When he finally calmed down, wiping his face with his sleeve, he looked embarrassed. "Sorry? Don't be sorry. Not ever. Not for this." They sat together as the sun set outside the window, painting the classroom in shades of orange and gold. Something had shifted between them, though neither could have put it into words yet. It was the first crack in the wall Daniel had built around himself, and the beginning of Rebecca understanding that this quiet boy in her classroom might need more than just a safe place to do homework. He might need someone who refused to give up on him. The months following that tearful October afternoon brought gradual changes in Daniel. They were small at first, barely noticeable to anyone else, but Rebecca saw them. He started participating more in class discussions, raising his hand once or twice a week instead of sitting in complete silence. His essays grew longer, more detailed, more willing to take emotional risks. And most importantly, he kept coming to her classroom after school. Their arrangement had evolved beyond just homework time. Sometimes Daniel would ask Rebecca about books she'd recommend. Other times they'd talk about colleges, about what he might want to study. He mentioned once, almost shyly, that he thought he might like to be a writer. Rebecca encouraged him, showed him literary magazines, helped him understand that writing could be more than just a hobby. But there were still hard days. Days when Daniel would show up to class with dark circles under his eyes, clearly exhausted. Days when he'd be jumpy and distracted, looking over his shoulder like he expected bad news at any moment. Rebecca learned not to pry, but to simply be available when he needed her. It was late November when Mrs. Patterson called Rebecca into her office again. The guidance counselor's expression was troubled, and Rebecca felt her stomach drop before she even sat down. "It's about Daniel," Mrs. Patterson said. "His current foster placement isn't working out. The family is going through a divorce and they've asked to have him moved. We're trying to find another home for him, but it's difficult. Teenagers are hard to place, especially ones who've been moved around so much." Rebecca felt something fierce and protective surge through her chest. "When does he have to leave?" "End of December, maybe sooner if we find something." Mrs. Patterson sighed heavily. "I hate this for him. He's finally starting to settle in, make some progress. This is going to be devastating." That afternoon, Daniel came to Rebecca's classroom as usual, but she could tell something was wrong before he even spoke. He dropped his backpack on the floor and slumped into a chair, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "They're moving me again," he said flatly. "Before Christmas," Rebecca set down her pen. "I heard. I'm so sorry." "It doesn't matter." His voice was hard, defensive. "I should have known better than to think anywhere was permanent. Nothing ever is. Daniel, I don't want to talk about it." He pulled out a textbook and opened it with more force than necessary. "I just want to do my homework." Rebecca respected his wish and returned to her grading, but her mind was racing. She thought about her empty house, the spare bedroom that had sat unused since her husband died. She thought about the quiet dinners alone, the weekends with nothing but lesson plans and housework to fill the time. She thought about the boy sitting in front of her, brilliant and broken, who'd been shuffled around like he didn't matter. The idea was crazy. She knew it was crazy. She was a single teacher living alone with no experience raising children. What did she know about being a foster parent, let alone to a traumatized teenager? But the idea wouldn't leave her alone. It followed her home that night, kept her awake until 3 a.m, and was still there when she woke up. 3 days later, Rebecca made an appointment with Mrs. Patterson. "I want to look into becoming Daniel's foster parent," she said, her heart pounding. "I know it's unusual and I know there's probably a lot of bureaucracy involved because I'm his teacher, but I want to try." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. "Rebecca, this is a huge commitment. Have you really thought this through?" "I've thought about nothing else for 3 days." Rebecca leaned forward. "I have a stable home, a steady income, and I already have a relationship with Daniel. He trusts me. Isn't that what he needs more than anything? Consistency? Someone who isn't going to give up on him?" The process was even more complicated than Rebecca had imagined. There were background checks, home studies, interviews, and mountains of paperwork. Because she was Daniel's teacher, there were additional layers of scrutiny, questions about boundaries and appropriate relationships. The school board had to be involved. Social workers visited her house multiple times, examining everything from her financial records to the smoke detectors in her hallway. Through it all, Rebecca didn't tell Daniel what she was doing. She didn't want to get his hopes up, didn't want to promise something she might not be able to deliver. She watched him grow more withdrawn as December approached, saw the walls going back up around his heart. It hurt to see him retreating into himself again, but she kept pushing forward with the paperwork. 2 weeks before Christmas, Mrs. Patterson called Rebecca with news. She'd been approved as a foster parent, and if Daniel agreed, he could move in with her over winter break. "If he agrees," Rebecca repeated. "You mean he doesn't know yet?" "We wanted to make sure everything was finalized first. The social worker is going to talk to him tomorrow." Mrs. Patterson paused. "Rebecca, I hope you know what you're getting into. Foster parenting isn't easy, especially with a teenager who's been through trauma." "I know," Rebecca said, though her hands were shaking. "I know it won't be easy." The next day was one of the longest of Rebecca's life. She taught her classes on autopilot, barely registering what she was saying. Daniel wasn't in school that day, pulled out for his meeting with the social worker. Rebecca spent her planning period staring at the clock, wondering what he was thinking, what he was feeling. When school ended, she went home instead of staying late like usual. She cleaned her already clean house, made dinner she was too nervous to eat, and jumped every time she heard a car go by. Her phone rang at 7 o'clock. It was Mrs. Patterson. He said yes, the guidance counselor said, and Rebecca could hear the smile in her voice. He was shocked at first, didn't believe it was real. But once he understood you'd been working on this for weeks, he broke down crying. "Happy tears, Rebecca. I think this is going to be good for both of you." Rebecca sat down heavily on her couch, her own tears spilling over. When can he move in? This weekend, if you're ready. I'm ready. That Saturday afternoon, a social worker's car pulled up in front of Rebecca's house. Daniel got out slowly, carrying 2 garbage bags that held everything he owned. Rebecca opened the door and stood on the porch, suddenly nervous. What if this was a mistake? What if she couldn't give him what he needed? But then Daniel looked at her and his eyes were different. Not empty anymore, but filled with something tentative and fragile. Hope. Hi, he said quietly. Hi, Rebecca replied. Welcome home. The first weeks were awkward. Daniel was polite to the point of being formal, always asking permission before touching anything, apologizing constantly for minor things. He kept his bedroom door closed and his belongings packed, like he was ready to leave at a moment's notice. Rebecca tried to give him space while also showing him he was wanted, a delicate balance that left her exhausted by the end of each day. There were difficult moments. One night, Rebecca knocked on his door to ask what he wanted for dinner and found him crying, clutching a small photo album. Another time, he had a nightmare so intense that Rebecca heard him screaming from down the hall. When she rushed to his room, he was disoriented and terrified, and it took 20 minutes to calm him down. Afterward, he was so embarrassed he wouldn't make eye contact with her for 2 days. But there were good moments, too. The first time, Daniel laughed at something Rebecca said while they were making breakfast together. The afternoon, he asked if they could watch a movie, and they ended up on the couch with popcorn, just like a normal family might do. The evening, Rebecca came home from a faculty meeting and found Daniel in the kitchen, attempting to make spaghetti as a surprise. The real turning point came in February. They were sitting at the dinner table, and Rebecca was telling a story about something that had happened at school. She made a joke, and Daniel actually grinned. "That's so typical of you, Mom," he said, and then froze. The word hung in the air between them. Mom. He'd said it without thinking, naturally, like it belonged there. His face went pale and he started to stammer an apology. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I know you're not actually—" "Daniel," Rebecca interrupted gently. "It's okay. More than okay." He looked at her with those eyes that had seen too much pain for someone so young. It slipped out. I wasn't trying to replace my real mom or anything." Rebecca reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You're not replacing anyone. Love doesn't work like that. Your mother will always be your mother, and she'll always be in your heart. But that doesn't mean there isn't room for other people too. If you want to call me Mom, I would be honored. And if you don't, that's okay too. There's no wrong answer here." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "I think I'd like to call you Mom, if that's really okay." "It's really okay." They both cried a little then, right there at the dinner table with half-eaten spaghetti between them. It wasn't a perfect moment from a movie. It was messy and emotional and complicated, but it was real and it was theirs. After that night, things shifted again. Daniel started unpacking his bags properly, putting his clothes in the dresser drawers instead of leaving them ready to go. He decorated his room with posters and books. He brought friends over from school for the first time. He started saying "we" in our house instead of being careful with his pronouns. The legal process to move from foster care to adoption began that spring. More paperwork, more interviews, more waiting. But this time, Daniel was part of it, actively wanting it, choosing this family they were building together. On the day they went to court for the final adoption hearing, Daniel wore a tie that had belonged to Rebecca's late husband. She'd offered it to him the night before, and he'd accepted it like the treasure it was. The judge asked Daniel if he understood what adoption meant, if he wanted Rebecca to become his legal mother. Daniel stood up straight and said clearly, "Yes, Your Honor, I do." His voice didn't shake at all. When the judge declared the adoption finalized, Rebecca and Daniel hugged in the courtroom. She felt him trembling and realized she was shaking too. They were officially family now, not just in their hearts but on paper in the eyes of the law. No one could take that away from them. That evening they had a small celebration at home with a cake from the grocery store and sparkling cider. Daniel had been quiet since leaving the courthouse, and Rebecca gave him space to process everything. As they sat on the couch after dinner, he finally spoke. "I didn't think I'd ever have a family again," he said softly. "After my parents died, I felt like that part of my life was just over. Like I'd always be alone. Rebecca wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "You're not alone. Not anymore. Not ever again." He leaned against her, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the sun set through the living room window. Two people who'd both lost everything they loved, who'd found each other in a high school classroom, who'd chosen to become family when the world kept trying to pull them apart. It wasn't the family either of them had planned for, but it was real and it was theirs, built on trust and time and the decision to keep showing up for each other, even when things got hard. Life settled into a rhythm after the adoption became official. Daniel finished his sophomore year with straight A's and even joined the track team at Rebecca's encouragement. She'd noticed him running alone in the neighborhood sometimes, using it as a way to clear his head, and suggested he might enjoy being part of a team. He was hesitant at first, afraid of getting close to people, but eventually agreed to try. Rebecca came to every single meet, even the away ones that required driving 2 hours. She'd stand on the sidelines with a thermos of hot chocolate, cheering louder than anyone else when Daniel ran. Watching him sprint around the track, seeing the determination on his face and the way his teammates congratulated him afterward, made her heart swell with pride. This was the same boy who'd hidden in the back of her classroom just 2 years ago, barely speaking, barely existing. Now he was living again. Junior year brought new challenges. Daniel started thinking seriously about college, about what he wanted to do with his life. Writing was still his passion, but he'd also developed an interest in social work. He told Rebecca one night that he wanted to help kids like him, kids who'd lost everything and needed someone to believe in them. "You'd be amazing at that," Rebecca said, and she meant it. Daniel had a way of understanding pain because he'd lived it. He'd be able to reach kids that other people might give up on. But there were still hard days. Grief didn't disappear just because life got better. On what would have been his mother's birthday, Daniel was quiet and withdrawn all day. Rebecca found him that evening sitting on his bedroom floor, looking through the photo album he'd brought with him to her house. She sat down beside him and he showed her pictures of his parents, telling her stories about them. His mother had loved gardening, filling their yard with flowers every spring. His father had been terrible at cooking but insisted on making pancakes every Sunday morning, always burning the first batch. They'd gone camping every summer, just the three of them, and his dad would tell ghost stories around the campfire that were more funny than scary. "They sound wonderful," Rebecca said softly. They were. Daniel traced his finger over a photo of his mother smiling in a garden. "I used to be afraid that loving you meant I was betraying them somehow. Like I was supposed to stay sad forever to prove I hadn't forgotten. And now?" He looked at her with those eyes that had grown less haunted over the past 2 years. "Now I think they'd be happy that I found you. My mom always said that love multiplies, it doesn't divide. I didn't understand what she meant back then, but I do now." Rebecca had to wipe her eyes. "I think she'd be very proud of the person you've become." Spring of junior year brought something unexpected. Daniel came home from school one afternoon with an unusual expression on his face, somewhere between nervous and excited. Rebecca was in the kitchen making dinner when he dropped his backpack by the door and just stood there, clearly wanting to say something but not sure how to start. "What's going on?" she asked, setting down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. "There's this girl," Daniel blurted out, his face turning red. "Her name is Lily Chen. She's in my calculus class, and we've been working on a project together." Rebecca smiled, trying not to make too big a deal of it, even though this was the first time Daniel had mentioned being interested in anyone. And I think I want to ask her to the spring dance. But I don't know if she'd say yes. I don't really know how to do this whole dating thing." He looked genuinely worried, and Rebecca's heart melted. "Well, let's think this through. Does she seem to enjoy talking to you? Does she laugh at your jokes?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, actually. And she always sits next to me in class now, even though she doesn't have to for the project anymore." "Those are good signs," Rebecca assured him. "The worst thing that can happen is she says no. And if she does, it's not the end of the world. But you'll never know unless you ask." He did ask the next day, and Lily said yes. Daniel came home that afternoon practically floating, and Rebecca couldn't remember ever seeing him this happy. When the night of the dance arrived, he was so nervous getting ready that he went through 3 different shirts before settling on one. Rebecca took pictures of him before he left, just like any mom would, and he tolerated it with an embarrassed grin. Lily turned out to be exactly the kind of person Rebecca had hoped Daniel would find. She was kind and smart with a quiet strength that reminded Rebecca a bit of Daniel himself. Lily came from a close-knit family with 2 younger brothers, and she had this way of making everyone around her feel comfortable. When Daniel brought her over for dinner for the first time, she helped Rebecca in the kitchen without being asked and genuinely laughed at Daniel's jokes. Over the following months, Lily became a regular presence in their lives. She'd come over to study, and Rebecca would make them snacks while they worked at the kitchen table. Sometimes the 3 of them would watch movies together, and Rebecca loved seeing how Daniel was with Lily, gentle and attentive and clearly head over heels. But Rebecca also made sure Daniel knew that being in a relationship didn't mean abandoning his other goals. They still had their weekly dinners, just the 2 of them, where they'd talk about college applications and his future. Daniel was applying to schools with strong creative writing and social work programs, and Rebecca helped him craft essays that told his story honestly, without making it sound like he was looking for sympathy. Senior year arrived faster than either of them expected. Daniel was chosen as one of the valedictorians, which meant he'd have to give a speech at graduation. He spent weeks working on it, writing and rewriting, showing drafts to Rebecca and asking for her feedback. She helped him find the right words, the ones that would honor his journey without dwelling too much on the pain. The night before graduation, Daniel couldn't sleep. Rebecca heard him moving around in his room at 2 a.m. and knocked softly on his door. He was sitting at his desk, his speech printed out in front of him. "Nervous?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "What if I mess up? What if I start crying in front of everyone?" Rebecca sat on the edge of his bed. "Then you cry. There's no shame in that. You've earned every emotion you feel, Daniel. Your story is powerful because it's real. And if people see that emotion, it just makes it more meaningful." He nodded, but still looked worried. "Can I read it to you one more time?" "Of course." He read through the entire speech, his voice steady and clear. It was beautiful. He talked about loss and resilience, about the teachers who make a difference, about finding hope when everything seems dark. He didn't mention Rebecca by name, but she knew the parts that were about her, about what she'd meant to him during those early days. When he finished, Rebecca had tears streaming down her face. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're going to do great." Graduation day was gorgeous, all blue skies and warm sunshine. Rebecca sat in the audience with Lily's family, who'd become close friends over the past year. When Daniel walked across the stage to get his diploma, she cheered so loud that people turned to look at her, but she didn't care. This was her son, her boy who'd come so far. When it was time for the valedictorian speeches, Rebecca's heart pounded. Daniel walked to the podium, and for a moment he just stood there looking out at the crowd. She could see him taking a deep breath, steadying himself. Then he began to speak. He talked about the class of graduating seniors, about their shared experiences and individual journeys. He talked about the teachers who'd shaped them, the challenges they'd overcome. And then he said something that made Rebecca's breath catch. "Most of you know my story, or at least parts of it. You know I lost my parents when I was 15. What you might not know is that I almost didn't make it to this moment. There was a time when I didn't want to be here anymore, when the pain felt too big and the future felt impossible." The crowd was completely silent. Daniel's voice stayed steady, but Rebecca could see his hands gripping the podium. But there was a teacher who noticed, who stayed late after school to give me a quiet place to exist, who didn't push or pry but just showed up day after day until I started to believe that maybe someone actually cared. That teacher didn't just help me with English homework. She taught me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes family is a choice, a decision to love someone even when it's hard, even when they push you away, even when the easy thing would be to give up. Rebecca felt Lily's mother squeeze her hand, and she realized she was crying. "That teacher became my mom," Daniel continued, and now his voice did crack slightly. "She opened her home and her heart to a broken kid who had nothing to offer, except a lot of baggage and a habit of running away when things got too real. She could have left me in that classroom, could have just been a nice teacher who cared from a distance. But she didn't. She jumped in all the way, and she changed my life." He paused, looking directly at Rebecca in the audience. "Mom, if you're listening, and I know you are because you're probably crying right now." Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. "Thank you. For seeing me when I was invisible. For choosing me when I was unchosen. For showing me that it's possible to build a life after everything falls apart." I love you." Rebecca couldn't see through her tears anymore. People around her were crying too, moved by the raw honesty of Daniel's words. He finished his speech with messages for his classmates, wishes for their futures, but Rebecca barely heard it. She was too overwhelmed by the love she felt for this young man who'd walked into her classroom 4 years ago and changed everything. After the ceremony, people swarmed Daniel. Teachers congratulated him, friends hugged him, parents of other students thanked him for his words. Rebecca hung back, giving him his moment, but then he found her in the crowd. He didn't say anything, just pulled her into a tight hug. "I meant every word," he whispered. "I know," she whispered back. "I love you too. So much." That evening, they had a party at the house with Lily's family and some of Daniel's closest friends. There was cake and laughter and a pile of graduation gifts. Rebecca watched Daniel moving through the crowd, confident and happy, occasionally catching her eye and grinning. This was what healing looked like, she thought. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of joy alongside it. Later, after everyone had gone home and Lily had left with one last kiss on Daniel's cheek, Rebecca and Daniel sat on the back porch in the warm evening air. They didn't need to talk. 4 years of knowing each other meant they could be comfortable in silence. "I got into State University social work program," Daniel said eventually. "Full scholarship." "That's wonderful." Rebecca turned to look at him. "When did you find out?" "Last week. I wanted to wait until after graduation to tell you." He smiled. "It's only 45 minutes away, so I can come home on weekends. You know you don't have to, right? College is about independence, finding yourself." "I know. But home is home. Why wouldn't I want to come back?" Rebecca felt that familiar tightness in her throat that meant tears were coming. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," Daniel said simply. They sat together as the stars came out, a teacher and her son, bound by choice and love, and the refusal to give up on each other. The journey had been hard, marked by grief and fear and uncertainty. But they'd made it through, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. College brought changes for both Daniel and Rebecca, but different than either of them expected. Daniel thrived at State University, diving into his social work classes with the same intensity he'd once poured into surviving each day. He came home most weekends like he'd promised, usually bringing a bag of laundry and stories about his professors, his new friends, and always stories about Lily. Lily had chosen to attend the same university. Though she was studying early childhood education, she and Daniel had decided to give long-distance dating a try during the summer, but being at the same school made everything easier. Rebecca watched their relationship deepen over Daniel's freshman year, seeing how they supported each other through exams and stress and homesickness. Rebecca had worried that she'd struggle with the empty nest, but she found herself surprisingly okay. She threw herself back into teaching with renewed energy, and she started a mentoring program at the high school for at-risk students. She called it the Second Chance Club, and it met after school in her classroom twice a week. The kids who came were the ones other teachers had given up on, the ones sitting in the back rows just like Daniel once had. When Daniel came home for Thanksgiving of his sophomore year, he seemed different. Not bad different, just more grown up somehow. He helped Rebecca cook the turkey and over mashed potatoes and stuffing. He told her that he'd been volunteering at a youth shelter near campus. "Some of these kids," he said, shaking his head, "they're living exactly what I lived through. Foster care trauma, feeling like nobody cares. And I can actually help them because I've been there. I get it in a way that other volunteers don't." "I'm so proud of you," Rebecca said, and she meant it completely. "I've been thinking," Daniel continued, looking at Lily, who smiled encouragingly. "I want to do more than just casework when I graduate. I want to create programs, maybe start a nonprofit eventually, something that helps kids like me find stable homes with people who actually care." Rebecca felt her eyes welling up. This was exactly why she'd fought so hard to adopt him, why she'd pushed through all the paperwork and doubt. She'd known he had this light inside him, this capacity to turn his pain into purpose. The rest of college passed in a blur of visits home, phone calls, and milestones. Daniel made Dean's List every semester. He started a peer support group for foster youth on campus. Lily became practically another daughter to Rebecca, calling her Mom Hayes and stopping by the house even when Daniel wasn't there. It was the spring of Daniel's senior year when he called Rebecca on a Tuesday evening, his voice nervous and excited in equal measure. "I need your help with something," he said. "Can I come home this weekend? It's important." Rebecca's mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. Was he sick? In trouble? But his tone didn't sound worried, just keyed up. "Of course, is everything okay? Everything's great. I just need to talk to you in person." That Saturday, Daniel showed up at the house mid-morning. He was dressed nicely, which was unusual for a casual visit, and he seemed jittery as he sat down at the kitchen table. "What's going on?" Rebecca asked, setting down 2 mugs of coffee. Daniel took a deep breath. "I want to ask Lily to marry me." Rebecca's hands flew to her mouth. "Oh my God, I know we're young. I know we're both about to graduate and start our careers. But Mom, I've known since sophomore year that she's the one. She's my best friend. She makes me better. She knows all my broken pieces and loves me anyway." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "I want to do this right, though. I wanted to talk to you first, and then I need to talk to her parents." Rebecca came around the table and hugged him tight. "She's going to say yes, and you two are going to be so happy." "You think so?" "I know so. I see the way she looks at you, Daniel. That girl is completely in love with you." They spent the next hour talking about his plan. He wanted to propose at the botanical gardens where they'd had their first date. He'd already talked to Lily's parents, who'd given their blessing, but he'd wanted Rebecca to be the first to know the actual plan. He was going to do it the weekend after graduation, when all the stress of finals and ceremonies was behind them. "Can I show you the ring?" he asked shyly. He opened the box and Rebecca gasped. It was beautiful, simple and elegant, with a small diamond set in a white gold band. But what made her tear up was the tiny detail. A small green stone set into the band alongside the diamond. "That's from my birth mom's jewelry," Daniel explained quietly. "You helped me save her things, kept them safe for me all these years. I wanted to have her there somehow, you know? Both my moms, part of this new beginning." Rebecca had to set down her coffee because her hands were shaking too much. "Daniel, that's beautiful. Really beautiful." Graduation came and went in another blur of ceremony and celebration. Daniel graduated summa cum laude, and he'd already accepted a job at a family services organization in the city, about an hour from where Rebecca lived. Lily had a teaching position lined up at an elementary school in the same area. They'd found an apartment together, planning to be roommates until, as Lily said with a knowing smile, plans changed. The next weekend, Daniel texted Rebecca early on Saturday morning. Just 3 words. She said yes. Rebecca called him immediately, crying happy tears while Daniel laughed and told her every detail. How nervous he'd been. How Lily had started crying before he even finished asking how perfect the moment had felt. They were engaged. Her son was getting married. The wedding planning started immediately, even though they'd set the date for a 1.5 years away to give themselves time to settle into their new jobs. Lily's mother was a force of nature when it came to organization, and she roped Rebecca into helping with everything. The 2 women spent hours looking at venues, discussing flowers, debating invitation designs. Rebecca loved being included, loved watching Lily's face light up when they found the perfect location, a restored barn with string lights and exposed wooden beams. She loved the way Daniel would sometimes just stop whatever he was doing and stare at Lily like he couldn't believe she was real. She loved seeing this young man, who'd once believed he'd never have a family again, building something beautiful and lasting. But there were also moments of bittersweetness. One afternoon, Rebecca was helping Lily try on wedding dresses when the younger woman suddenly started crying in the dressing room. "What's wrong?" Rebecca asked through the curtain. "Nothing's wrong," Lily said, opening the curtain. She looked stunning in the dress, but tears were running down her face. "I just wish Daniel's birth parents could be here to see this, to see who he's become. It feels wrong that they're not part of this." Rebecca stepped into the dressing room and took Lily's hands. "They are part of this. They're in every good choice Daniel makes, every kind word he speaks. They gave him his foundation, and that's still there. It always will be. I want to honor them somehow," Lily said. "In the wedding. I don't know how, but I want them to be remembered." They eventually decided on a small table at the reception with photos of loved ones who'd passed away. Daniel's parents would be there, alongside Lily's grandmother and Rebecca's late husband. It felt right, acknowledging that love doesn't end just because someone is gone. As the wedding date approached, Rebecca found herself feeling emotional at unexpected moments. Helping Daniel move into his and Lily's apartment, she'd cried. Watching him at his new job, competent and caring with the families he worked with, she'd cried. Finding his old school uniform in a box in the attic, she'd definitely cried. One evening, about a month before the wedding, Daniel came over for their weekly dinner. It was just the two of them like old times, and Rebecca had made his favorite meal, pot roast with all the fixings. "I've been working on my vows," Daniel said as they cleaned up after dinner, "and I keep getting stuck on one part." "What part?" "The part about family. About how Lily's not just marrying me, she's joining our family, but I don't know how to put into words what our family means." "What you mean to me?" Rebecca dried her hands on a dish towel and turned to face him. "Your vows are about you and Lily, you don't need to include me." "But that's the thing, Mom, I can't talk about my life without talking about you. You're the reason I'm standing here at all. You're the reason I learned how to trust again, how to love again. Lily fell in love with the person you helped me become." They stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd had so many conversations over the years, where Daniel had first accidentally called her Mom, where they'd celebrated graduations and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays. "Then say that," Rebecca said softly. "Say that you learned how to love because someone showed you it was safe to try again. You don't need to make it complicated, Daniel. The truth is always enough." He hugged her then, a long, tight hug that said everything words couldn't. When he pulled back, he was smiling. "I'm getting married." "You're getting married," Rebecca repeated, laughing through her tears. "How did we get here?" "One day at a time," Daniel said. "Just like you always told me." The month before the wedding flew by in a flurry of final preparations. Rebecca gave a small engagement party at her house where both families came together. She watched Daniel and Lily surrounded by people who loved them, and she thought about how far they'd all come. These two young people who'd found each other, who were building a life together despite all the reasons they might have stayed closed off and afraid. The night before the wedding, there was a rehearsal dinner at a nice restaurant downtown. Speeches were made, toasts were given, and everyone was laughing and happy. Daniel pulled Rebecca aside at one point, leading her out to the restaurant's patio where it was quieter. "I wanted to give you something," he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I wrote you a letter. For tomorrow. But I wanted you to read it tonight in case it makes you cry, which it probably will." Rebecca took the envelope with shaking hands. "Should I read it now?" "If you want. Or wait until you're alone. Whatever feels right." She decided to wait, tucking the envelope into her purse. They stood together on the patio looking out at the city lights, both thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would come after. "Are you nervous?" Rebecca asked. "Not even a little bit," Daniel said, and he meant it. "I'm ready. For all of it. The wedding, the marriage, the life we're going to build. I'm finally ready to be completely happy without feeling guilty about it." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "Your parents would be so happy for you, Daniel. They'd love Lily." "I think so too," he said quietly. "And they'd be grateful to you for taking care of me when they couldn't. For loving me back to life." That night, alone in her house, Rebecca opened Daniel's letter. By the time she finished reading, she'd gone through half a box of tissues. He'd written about that first day of class, about how close he'd come to giving up, about the moment he realized she wasn't going to abandon him. He thanked her for every small thing and every big thing, for the patience and the pushing, for knowing when to hold on and when to let go. The letter ended with a simple line. "Tomorrow I marry the love of my life. But you gave me back my life to live. Thank you, Mom. For everything." Rebecca folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where she kept all her most precious things. Tomorrow her son would get married, and she would be there, watching him promise forever to someone who deserved his beautiful, hard-won heart. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, the kind of golden autumn afternoon that seemed designed for new beginnings. Rebecca woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves even though she wasn't the one getting married. She'd hardly slept, her mind running through everything that needed to happen, every moment she wanted to remember. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock at the barn venue, with the reception to follow immediately after. Rebecca arrived early to help with last-minute preparations. Though Lily's mother had everything so well organized, there was barely anything left to do. The barn had been transformed into something magical, with white flowers everywhere and those string lights Daniel had loved, creating a warm glow, even in the afternoon light. Daniel was in a back room with his groomsmen. And when Rebecca knocked softly on the door, one of his college friends let her in. Her son stood in front of a mirror adjusting his tie for probably the 10th time. He looked so handsome in his suit, so grown up, that for a moment Rebecca couldn't speak. "Mom," Daniel said, turning to face her. His eyes were already a bit red, like he'd been crying or trying not to. "How do I look? Like the man I always knew you'd become?" Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. He crossed the room and hugged her, and she held on tight, memorizing this moment. Her boy, all grown up, about to start a new chapter. She thought about that broken 15-year-old in the back of her classroom, and then looked at this confident, loving man, and felt overwhelmed by how much could change, how much healing was possible. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered into his shoulder. "So incredibly proud." "I love you, Mom," he said. "Thank you for being here. For always being here." They pulled apart, both wiping their eyes and laughing at themselves. "You better get yourself together," Rebecca teased. "You can't cry before the ceremony even starts." "No promises," Daniel said with a watery smile. Rebecca left him with his friends and went to check on Lily, who was in another room with her bridesmaids. The bride looked absolutely stunning in her dress, her hair styled in soft waves, a simple veil completing the look. When she saw Rebecca, she lit up. "Mom Hayes," she said, using the name she'd adopted for Rebecca. "Come here, I need to show you something." She pulled Rebecca aside and pointed to her bouquet. Tucked into the white roses and greenery was a small photo charm with a picture of Daniel's parents on their wedding day. "Daniel gave it to me this morning," Lily explained. "He said he wanted his first family to be part of this day, that they should be here with us." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears for probably the 20th time that day. "That's beautiful, sweetie. Really beautiful." The ceremony began right on time. Rebecca sat in the front row on Daniel's side, Lily's parents directly across the aisle. The barn filled with friends and family, people from all parts of Daniel and Lily's lives. Rebecca spotted some of Daniel's professors, co-workers from his job, and even a few of the kids from the youth shelter he volunteered at. When the music started and everyone stood, Rebecca's heart felt like it might burst. The bridesmaids came down the aisle first, then the groomsmen. Then Daniel entered with Lily's father, who'd offered to walk with him since Daniel's own father couldn't be there. Rebecca saw Daniel's jaw tighten with emotion, and she knew he was thinking about his dad, wishing he could be here. But then the bride appeared, and Daniel's face transformed. Pure joy, pure love, pure certainty. Lily walked down the aisle with her mother, and when she reached Daniel, the look that passed between them was so intimate, so full of promise, that Rebecca had to pull out her tissue. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. The officiant talked about love that heals, about choosing each other every day, about building a life together from scratch. When it was time for vows, Daniel went first. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, but after looking at it, he put it back in his pocket. "I wrote these down," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet barn, "because I wanted to make sure I got the words right. But standing here looking at you, I realize the words don't matter as much as the truth behind them.